everyone. Thanks for joining us for this special presentation with our partners over at GuardWare. Today we've got Rizwan Mahmood, the CEO of GuardWare Australia, who's going to lead us on a discussion around classifying your data as part of those first steps to securing the information that you hold dear. And we won't hold up too much, so yeah, I'll pass it over to you now, Rizwan.
Thanks, James. Good afternoon to everyone. Hope you're well. All right, just confirming if the screen, everything is coming out all right. Okay, awesome. Okay, so today we are going to be talking about a topic which is very dear to my heart, which is how do we actually control information, right? And the agenda for today is we'll go and ask ourselves what is really information security. We'll cover elements of data classification process. What does it mean? And more importantly, well, how do we start? Where do we get, how do we get this process going for us? Now, before we go into any of those discussions, we need to ask ourselves a very basic question. And that is, what does it really mean to be secure? You know, and ask a question to ourselves is, why does a company really invest in security? And the answer every time I ask this question to C-suites or information owners, the answer is always that we want to reduce our risk. Now, it is important to get the answer for this question, not from the cyber team, not from the IT team, but from people who run the business, who own the business, because the answers are quite different from their perspective. A lot of time, their risk is, well, we might lose a contract because we don't have the relevant security compliance right now. Or we might lose business because if we get breached, you know, our reputation might get impacted. So I think you guys need to do something about it. Or risk of losing commercial trust. A very good example of this happened recently in MediSecure breach, which happened in Australia, a company that handles prescriptions. And within months, the company went under administration, basically went bust because they couldn't pay the fine. And there was a major loss of reputation, and a fledgling business within months just closed down. And if you look at all these risks which I'm talking about, right, there's one common element in all of them, if you notice. It's all to do with information. It's all to do with keeping information secure. It has a lot less to do with hackers or a lot less to do with cyber, but from a business perspective, their key focus is always going to be keep my information secure. And if you look at it from this angle, it starts to look much more of a business risk rather than a cyber risk. And that's the first thing we need to get across when we are dealing with information security. And that obviously takes us to the definition of what is information security. Well, information security is all about keeping information safe. Now, this is not a new concept. I mean, information security has been around since the day of the pyramids. I mean, at that time it was papyrus and people want to secure it. And another thing that people get wrong about information security, because they all the time think about data or information and all that, but the fact is that it actually includes a lot more stuff in it, because there is a physical control element to it, which is your access cards, your CCTVs, your all that, which has a place as far as securing your information is concerned. It also has an administrative element to it, which is a lot to do with the policies, the procedures. Remember, it's a business risk. So you need to have the administration side of it, the administrative side of it, well written down and in control. And then you have the technical control side of it, which is very much the nuts and bolts of how you're going to keep that information secure. Now, over the last couple of decades, since information has moved away from being in a physical form, papers and folders, into more data oriented. So these days, when we say information security, we are very much talking about the process of protecting data. uh, we are basically talking about process of protecting data, and that's called information security. Now, this process includes three key steps, or three you can call them almost like you need to do these processes or these steps in order to enforce information security within your organization. The first one is to identify and understand key information assets. The second one is to classify data based on sensitivity and security levels. And the third one is you apply the protection control based on their value and risk. We are going to go into detail about each one of those steps because that's the fundamental way of how you do information security, and that has a direct relation to the data classification and how you do protection in your organization. Right? So let's start with the first step. All right. The first step is to identify and understand your key information assets. Now, examples, some of these information assets are in front of you. Some examples can be like intellectual property, your financial records, your client data, your employee or HR records. But what you really need to do here is you really need to understand them, not just identify them, but you really need to understand what this data is. In other words, you need to ask these questions about the data. All right. What is it? How is it produced? Who creates it? How is it used? All right. Who needs it? Where does it get processed? Where is it stored really? And how long do we need it? So the first step is when we say identify information, discover information, understand your information, you're really asking a lot of these fundamental questions about each and every data business. And that's fundamental because only when you understand what that information is, how is it being used, how is it being transferred. Let's use an example here. Let's use IP, intellectual property, and let's use a software company as an example here. For a software company, their intellectual property is their source code. All right. So that's definable because that's their bread and butter. That's the system they produce. So you need to understand how is it produced. Okay, these are 5 developers that produce this source code. All right, they are the one who create it, and they are the one who actually mostly use it. But is it all of them that need to have access to all the modules of the source code? Maybe there's one portion that is sensitive, but not the other. Then you might have other teams inside your organization which are doing quality assurance, testing, etc. So again, they also need to have access to it to try and test that software. So you need to understand how is it getting processed. Maybe they are placing those source code in a particular location, in a folder, file, somewhere to have other people access that. Who are those other people who are accessing it? And who are those people who don't need to access it? So where is it stored? Is it on the desktops and laptops of the developers, but also in your file servers, in your databases? So you can run this kind of questions for each different types of information assets that you have, and you should run it with your information owners. Another example can be such as credit card data. Another example can be your engineering files. It can be any type of information, but you first need to make a schematic about what is it, how is it being used, who has it, where is it, all right, what applications are producing it. And that's a fundamental first step. Once we have an understanding of what information we have, the next step is, all right, we need to now define the next step is to classify it basically, or categorize it. based on sensitivity and security of that information. All right. Now, this process of classifying information based on its importance and sensitivity is really what is called as data classification. All right. Because not all information needs to be protected or handled equally, right? Like, for example, you have company credit card information. All right. So sensitivity of that is pretty high. You want to keep it in control. There's only few people who have access to it. So the security level of that is also pretty high. You want to keep it in control. You want to make sure it's not left in an unencrypted form or in a text-based form lying around in your emails, in your desktops, wherever it is. You want to keep it locked down. All right. But yet then you have other examples like your marketing information, which is something that, or marketing flyers, for example, which is, well, sensitivity is low. Do I really need to worry about who is accessing this? Where is it being stored? Not really. It is good to have it in one location because you don't want to lose information. But from a business impact point of view, not much. All right. If it goes out in the market, fine. It's not going to cause much harm. So maybe it's the security level doesn't have to be that high on it. So once you understand that information, then you can start to apply what kind of security you need around it. So data classification is very much your primary process that governs how data gets protected. But how do you do classifications? Now, this is done using classification schemes, which are basically templates. All right. So for example, here you can see two classification schemes. The top one is what the Australian government uses, and the one at the bottom, public, internal use, confidential, is a standard corporate version of a classification scheme. Now, the main thing in classification schemes is the business impact definition. That's the primary element of a classification scheme. And many people get it wrong. They don't look at it from that angle. Because when you're defining a classification scheme, you need to define from your business perspective, if something is classified as, say, confidential or protected or secret, what is the impact on the business that if we lose that information, which is classified as, say, secret, what is the business impact that your organization will have from it? So it's really classification schemes are very much defining your roadmap of how you implement security, how you protect data, and how you will have different policies and procedures in order to meet that particular impact, or in order to mitigate that impact if something happens to that data. So most of what I normally recommend companies is to select one of these two classification schemes. Doesn't matter which one you use. The one on the top becomes too complicated because most of the company wouldn't have something as a top secret. The one at the bottom is what normally companies use. And in my experience, don't go beyond 4 to 5 levels. It starts to get really, really complicated. All right. But those are your buckets basically. And let's look at some examples over here. Let's look at some examples here. For example, internal only, you have stuff like, okay, let's look at public. For public information is stuff that has low impact. There is no business impact if it gets stolen or lost. It's already public knowledge. So you'll place stuff like marketing materials, contact information, price list around there. Then you have internal only data that is not meant for public exposure. Is it sensitive, not sensitive? Is dependent on your definition of that. All right. So classification scheme is a very company oriented process, which you need to sit down with your information owners and define it. But once defined, you follow it. You don't change it on an ongoing basis because that's your buckets that you have defined. If you don't do it in this fashion, security becomes a nightmare to implement, because this information needs some other way of handling and this information might need some other way of handling. Then you really don't have any way of standardization of security in your organization. So this helps to standardize that, right? So internal only, like internal data not meant for public exposure. So things like competitive intelligence, sales playbook, all right? Then you have stuff under confidential, like contracts with vendors, employee reviews, etc. And then you can have restricted, like PII data, credit card information, and so on, all right? So now that we have classified the information, the next step is, well, now we can start to apply some level of protection around it based on their classification levels. Now, what you have in front of you right now is basically, I mean, this session is not long enough for us to go into the various ways of how you protect information. But in generally, if you look at how you want to protect any data or any information, you're primarily doing 4 steps around that. All right. You are educating the users, and this education of users becomes a primary requirement, especially the moment you start down information security journey, because users are going to question everything that you do. They will say, why do I have to classify this as confidential when I know that this data has to be used by X, Y, and Z? So it's actually a very interesting process. It's a process where you can engage with information owners and they start to feel connected with security and start to become part of the solution rather be the problem. The second is, obviously you need to have accurate access controls, and that becomes part of your identification and understanding of data in the first process. That's what's going to feed into it. And the next third point is you need persistent information protection. Now, how do you achieve persistent information protection? That might be through encryption, antivirus, trying to protect data from hacks, locking down files with passwords, encrypting it, putting your controls. But the objective is you want persistent information control all the time, irrespective of whether it's within your organization or outside of the organization. That's the ultimate game, that what you want from a protection point of view. And then you obviously want visibility and alerts around that. So you want to be told that, okay, something is at risk, so I better do something about it. Okay. So, so these are the 3 key steps. Now, it is important to understand that these 3 steps, unfortunately, are not a one-time process. All right. One of the first things and one of the hardest things one of the hardest things to understand in information security is that this is an ongoing process. And this simple fact that this is an ongoing process is also our saving grace, because a lot of people have a lot of challenges when they want to implement information security, because they look at this massive problem because they don't know where to start. It's just too big. Do I go with the finance department? Do I go with the operations department? Do I go to the HR people? Where do I really start? It's so big and it's so wide. The answer to that is you go use case by use case. And you cycle around these 3 steps. You identify one key piece of information. You understand that key piece of information. You classify those piece of key information. You protect that key piece of information and you keep rotating around. So it's an ongoing process. It has to be built as a business process, as a security governance process, which we call it overall, on an ongoing basis that has to be implemented within the organization, and it has to be done on a regular basis. Because do remember, information that is classified, maybe something is classified, say, as confidential today because we were preparing this tender which is considered as confidential, but now the tender is out in the public. It's no longer confidential, if you notice. It's in the public. So the classification now has to be moved to public. So the system, the information also evolves. So you need to be able to evolve information and how it is being used on an ongoing basis. Right? Right. So where do we start? Now, so as per the steps that I mentioned just now, the 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 first step which you need to do is to identify and understand the information. Now, as part of this webinar and with our partnership with Wyze Group, we are doing for the participants a free data risk assessment offer right now. This offer allows you to uses tools, GuardWare assessment tools to identify what sensitive data you have, where is it being stored, who is accessing that information, is it at risk. Basically, it will help you get your first process done or your first step done to understand what data you have, is it at risk, how is it being used, is where you actually can get started with. Because without knowing what you have and how is it being used, you're not really going to be able to protect it in the anyway. All right. Right. And these are some examples of companies which have already used this process, and we have loads of others all the time. All right. Thank you for joining us. That brings me to the end of my presentation, and that gives us enough time for any question and answers or Q&A that you guys might have.
A great presentation, mate. It really highlights the importance of data security and understanding the approach to knowing what you have so that you can actually protect it. A big challenge is that, often companies will consider DLP as something that's, more the bigger end of town, being data loss prevention. How do small businesses today approach this in a really simple way? What might the next logical step be for them?
Yeah, the thing now, what has happened is that DLP used to be the origination of the concept of DLP really started in the US defense. That's where it started. This goes back nearly 30 years now. All right. But over the years now, for us, the technologies has now evolved. You don't really need to look at DLP as a set of controls to block things from happening. Most of the organizations in Australia, which are SMB and mid-scale organization, work on a trust-based model, but that trust-based model needs a very important facet, that is verification, because trust is not enough. People might make mistakes. A lot of us are still working from home, and work from home is now here to stay. You can have systems that can easily monitor movement and access and storage of information across everything, not only your endpoint devices, but also your cloud. So the first step for any company is obviously what I mentioned. Start by assessing what information you have, what are the use cases around that, and implement one of these solutions to help you get going with it. Those have become quite easy and mainstream now.
Right. No, that's really important information. Might open it up to the attendees today. I'll just get the Q&A running. If anyone wants to jump into the Q&A and ask any questions of Rizwan or myself, please feel free to do that at this time. We've got a few more minutes to take any specific questions you may have. And of course, if now's not the right time, you can always approach us after this event through the details provided. No, not at this time. Although I did get a question before the session that someone did want to have answered, and it was about regulator compliance. So for a business that hasn't gone through the process of classifying their data, what might they be able to do to respond to a regulator inquiry in a sort of a quick fashion, or is this something that really can't be turned on overnight?
Not well, I can answer it from a GuardWare perspective. So what happens with our solution is that if you have any, like we have loads of healthcare organizations as our customers, we have schools as our customers, and all of them are under quite heavy regulations right now. So what we normally do for those organizations, and believe me, many of them haven't got their classification done and dusted. It's a very hard process to implement. So what we normally do is remember that cycle that I have mentioned to you. We start by first understanding how that information is being used and moved, because if they are trying to, for example, there are some low-hanging fruits because their staff might be mishandling that information by, say, uploading it to things like ilovepdf.com, right? They might be just converting a file without thinking that that is a free website and they should not be doing it. Another example these days we are getting a lot is people are using a lot of AI tools. They are pasting a lot of information inside it. Again, not for any nefarious reasons, but you start to look at the common use cases first, and those are already your wins because under compliance regulations, you need cloud coverage, you need information management, you need some level of control of how information is going. You need to have control over shadow IT. And I'm talking through ISO 27000. Literally, I'm just walking through if you go through those controls. Now, as you have the solution implemented, one of the things we do is we don't really need to depend on files being classified because we can look at content itself. And that has been the reason why we had higher adoptability within medium and SMB customers because they didn't have the classifications. So they said, well, how do I protect my PII data? I said, no problem, because we can look at credit card data, we can look at tax file numbers, we can look at healthcare information, we can look at any kind of IP in the files, in the information, in text, and we can control it rather than relying on everybody to classify information. But that doesn't mean it doesn't get stopped there. It's a maturity cycle. So you get your early wins, and as you mature, you keep on implementing more and more controls using the same GuardWare stack, basically.
Yeah, it's great. I mean, it really highlights that this is a business problem first, and technology can assist, but ultimately, if we can get our classification framework in place, our governance framework, all working together, then we can leverage tools like GuardWare and the services that we can provide today through the technology available more broadly, that we can really get to the heart of how to secure an organization from a data perspective.
Yep, absolutely. That's exactly what it is. It's a business problem, especially when you deal with information. It's 100% it's a business risk. And it has to be dealt like a business risk because any control you put on information management is going to be directly impacting your end customer, end users. And you want them engaged with this process because they know the information better than you. So from an implementation perspective, these solutions and technologies have to work hand in hand, very much in a decentralized manner, and which is what GuardWare does as well. We work in a decentralized manner as a data management tool almost for the company and the information owners. Yeah,
absolutely. Rizwan, thank you so much, and thank you to all the attendees today for joining us on this really invaluable session. So thank you again for sharing, and if you're interested in taking up the offer that GuardWare Australia has put forward through us, which is a gold partner of GuardWare Australia at Wyze, please reach out to us. I'll send a follow-up email to everyone that's joined today. We'll look forward to speaking with you soon. I hope you found value today. Thanks for coming.
Thanks for everyone. Thanks, James. Take care.